Hello, my fellow forgiven sinners, and welcome to our series on the Catechism. We're going through the 10 Commandments. This video will be looking at both the conclusion of the 10 Commandments and also the first commandment. We're going a little bit out of order if you're following along in your catechism, but we are following the order in the actual scriptures. The Bible gives us the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20. We'll read verses 1 through 6 there as the basis of this video. Before we jump into our commandments, one quick note about the numbering of the commandments. You've maybe noticed if you've talked with different groups within both Christianity and Judaism, you may notice a different numbering system for the 10 Commandments, which commandment is which number. And this happens because the 10 Commandments are found in Exodus chapter 20, where we have more than 10 commands. And so the question comes up, well, what exactly is the division? Some traditions will divide up coveting into two different commandments. Some traditions will divide up you shall have no other gods and you shouldn't make for yourself a graven image into two commandments. My personal favorite is actually the Jewish enumeration, as I understand it. They actually don't say the 10 commandments, they see it as the 10 sentences or the 10 words. And the first word is what we consider to be the conclusion. It's God explaining who he is, who the actual author of these 10 commandments is. So we'll talk a little bit about those things as we get into our first section here, the conclusion of the 10 commandments and also the first commandment. We'll start with that reading from Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 6, where we kind of get both of these combined. We read, "Then God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from the land of Egypt where you were slaves. You shall have no other gods beside me. You shall not make any carved image for yourself or a likeness of anything in heaven above or on the earth below or in the waters under the earth. Do not bow down to them or be subservient to them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. I follow up on the guilt of the fathers with their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren, if they also hate me. But I show mercy to thousands who love me and keep my commandments." So here you see the first commandment and the conclusion kind of interwoven together, and it's very valuable for us to have those two together, as God tells us to worship no one but him, to have no other God but him. So it's valuable for us to define who exactly is this God who is giving us these commandments, who is commanding us to worship no one except for him. A couple things to address here. First off, God calls himself a jealous God. That seems really off-putting for a lot of people. I mean, jealousy is a very petty human emotion, right? How can we look up to a God who calls himself jealous? Why would we care about a God if he has such petty human emotions just like we do? And yet, think about what it means for God to be jealous. What happens if somebody believes in this one true God? He brings us eternal salvation, right? When we trust in this God, he believes this is a good thing, he gets to bless us for all eternity, right? Whereas if we reject him, then we forfeit his eternal blessings. We live without any goodness in our lives anymore. And so this is what God wants for all people. He wants all people to be saved. He doesn't want anybody to go to hell. And so yes, he is jealous for our sake. He's jealous because as people believe in him, they go to heaven, right? God doesn't get anything out of our salvation. Again, he's worshiped, glorified, praised, everything without us. He doesn't need our love. He doesn't need our worship, but we need his blessing. And so God's jealousy is actually a good thing because it comes from somebody that actually is love. Another thing that really bothers people here in this description of God is that God brings punishment to the third and fourth generation, as other translations will say. And people will say, well, hold on, why should God punish children for the sins of their fathers? And something that you're going to notice as you watch families or if you interact with people generationally speaking, you'll notice that the sins and temptations and idols that a family struggles with will often get passed down to their kids. Think about, for example, things like money, right? We generally don't teach money in schools. And so for the most part, people learn how to use money, how to treat money, how to think about money. They learn that from watching their parents. And so if your parents were really bad with money, they were constantly in debt and never able to really get ahead at all, chances are you're set up to live that kind of a life. right? Also, biologically speaking, there are things like this. For example, if your parents had a problem with alcohol, if they were alcoholic or something like that, you may have a genetic disposition to be more prone to have that kind of a problem in your life as well. And so this is really a warning for us that we inherit certain temptations from our families. And if you're a parent, you have a tendency to pass on your idols, your temptations to the next generation. So it's valuable for us to be really careful to keep a clear eye out for what has been passed on to us and what we therefore are passing on to our children. So let's look at that. Who is the author of the Ten Commandments? This is exactly what we talk about in the conclusion to the commandments. Luther explains the conclusion of the commandments this way. He writes, "What does this mean? God threatens to punish all who transgress these commandments. Therefore, we should fear his anger and not disobey what he commands. But he promises grace and every blessing to all who keep these commandments. Therefore, we should love and trust in him and gladly obey what he commands." So this is a really important thing for us to recognize. When we're talking about the Ten Commandments, notice the order of what God speaks about here in Exodus chapter 20. You see, every single man-made religion, every single human philosophy says, if I do good, then I'm going to get good, right? If I earn God's favor, then God will save me. But what do we have here in the Ten Commandments? God announces himself as the God who has already saved them. You see, God does it backwards. God saves us first, and then he gives us his commands. And so the following of God's commands is not a way for us to earn our spot with God. God saves us apart from us. And then, having saved us, now God shows us how we can live in this salvation that Jesus has brought us. For the Old Testament believers, God saved them from slavery in Egypt. For us, in New Testament believers, we look back and see the spiritual reality of him saving us from the slavery of sin, death, and Satan. Right? Now that he has set us free, this is how we live in that freedom. The commandments are the way that we live in that freedom. Now, something I want to address. I remember hearing this old attack against Christianity, and there was a young kid who said that God is the sort of person who is constantly watching people in case they ever have any fun, just so he can jump in and stop it. Kind of a silly thought there, right? But this is how a lot of people see the commandments. They see the commandments as binding us, as stopping us from enjoying life as much as we could, or getting as much out of this life as we could. But consider these words from the Apostle John in 1 John chapter 4, verses 7 through 12. This is how he explains Christian morality. He says, "Dear friends, let us love one another, because love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. The one who does not love has not known God, because God is love. This is how God's love for us was revealed. God has sent his only begotten Son into the world so that we might live through him. This is love. Not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the atoning sacrifice for our sins. Dear friends, if God loved us so much, we also should love one another. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God remains in us, and his love has been brought to its goal in us." Notice how the Apostle Paul talks about Christian morality. He says it's all about love. And we saw this last time as we got that summary of all of Christian morality, that it's simply all about love. Loving God above all, and loving my neighbor as myself. And so the Ten Commandments are really God who has designed love, who has designed all of us. He's showing us this is how we actually accomplish love for our fellow man, for our fellow human beings, right? And so this is good, right? Who on earth thinks it's not freeing to love other people, right? To want to be selfish, is that really freedom? Is that what we want to be fighting for, right? No, we want to do good in the world. We want to do good for our neighbor. And so this is what the Ten Commandments give us. It's not a way to bind us up. Instead, it's a way for us to enjoy more life, a life of love. One more thing for us to consider before we move on to the first commandment. God tells us that we are to fear him. In fact, you can read in the scriptures, Proverbs chapter 1, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but stubborn fools despise wisdom and discipline." Have you ever heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect? I've spoken about this previously if you follow my sermons, but in the Dunning-Kruger effect, basically what it means is that people who are completely incompetent on a subject, they believe that they know all there is to know on the subject. They believe they're experts. You've probably seen this in quite a lot of people. People speaking very boldly, very courageously, very forcefully on subjects that they have never studied, never really looked into, subjects they really know nothing about. Right? And this is actually kind of a regular phenomenon. Because you don't know anything about the subject, you don't know how much you don't know. Right? And so the more you learn about a subject, the more you realize there's so much more for me to understand. There's so much more for me to learn about. Right? And so the fear of the Lord, I really believe, is this weapon against our arrogance. We naturally have this arrogant belief that we already understand spiritual matters. We already have morality figured out. We're already good people. What more could God possibly have to teach me? In fact, I could probably teach God a thing or two, right? That's naturally how we are. But the fear of God is a warning for us, right? It's a way to fight back against that arrogance and pride and instead recognize, hey, there's probably a lot I have to learn, right? It's good for me to study what God says. It's good for me to learn what he has to say. And frankly, that kind of humility is just a wise way to live your life. Anytime you're in a situation, just assume that the other person maybe knows something you don't. And I'll tell you what, you'll learn way more than you would otherwise just by blowing people off and assuming that you already have it all figured out. So we've got this figured out here now, right? This is the God who is giving us commandments. He is the God who loves us. He is the God who is himself love. He is the God who wants to see us love one another. And this is why he's giving us these commandments. He's not trying to keep us from having fun. He's trying to show us the way. He's trying to show us the right path for us human beings to walk. And that path is love. And so this is what we're digging into as we read through these commandments. God is showing us the best way that we can live our lives, the best way that we can love our neighbors. So let's look at the first commandment. We already read that in Exodus, so let's go straight to Luther's explanation. He looks at the first commandment, you shall have no other gods. What does this mean, Luther writes? We should fear, love, and trust in God above all things. Once again, something for us to recognize, right? As Luther thinks through what does it mean to worship something, and he grabs out three distinct ideas. The thing I fear most becomes my God. And again, that makes a lot of sense, right? You think about how much respect you give to somebody you fear, right? If you fear a bully at school, right, you're going to listen when they talk, right? You're going to do what they say. And so God says, of all the things you're going to fear, be most afraid of him. Love. Luther grabs love out, all right? Anything of all the things that we're going to love, again, the thing that we love most is going to become a god, an idol in our lives. And so again, we want to make sure that we're aiming that love at the proper place. In fact, I've recently come across some pastors who will actually describe sin as misplaced love. An example from the scriptures, you go to Genesis and you read about Jacob. He's the guy whose name is later changed to Israel. He had 12 sons, but he loved his son Joseph the most. He kind of played favorites. And frankly, he made his entire family miserable because he played favorites. Now think about that for a second, right? He created all this strife, all of this competition, all of this hatred and bitterness in his family because he loved his son. Now, should a father love his son? Absolutely, but his love was misplaced, right? He loved one son too much and the other sons not enough. And so this is exactly what happens. When we love one of God's gifts or some good thing in this world, when we love that too much, it can cause disaster and pain and suffering in the world. But when we love God the most, then everything else can fall into place. Finally, the last thing that Luther looks to is trust, right? Do you trust in God most of all, or do you trust something else most of all? Once again, Luther recognizes that what you trust in the most is going to become a god or potentially an idol for you, right? Now again, we want to think through this clearly, right? Because a lot of people, when they hear this idea of you shall have no other gods, when they look at the first commandment, they think of bowing down to some statue of wood or stone, and they think, I've never done that before, no problem. Well, there's a fascinating quote from an atheist named David Foster Wallace. David Foster Wallace, again, like I said, he's an atheist, and so he doesn't really consider idolatry to be a sin or anything like that. But he has a very interesting way of looking at this idea of worship. Here's from a quote from David Foster Wallace. It's a speech that he gave, a commencement speech. I'll actually post a link to a video where you can hear a fuller version of the speech if you're interested. He's a really fascinating guy. Anyway, he said, "In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And the compelling reason for maybe choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough. Never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally plant you. On one level, we all know this stuff already. It's been codified as myths, proverbs, cliches, epigrams, parables, the skeleton of every great story. The whole trick is keeping the truth up front in daily consciousness. Worship power, and you will end up feeling weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to numb you to your own fear. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart. You will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. Look, the insidious thing about these forms of worship is not that they are evil or sinful, it is that they are unconscious. They are default settings. They are the kind of worship you just gradually slip into day after day. See what he's getting at there with that quote? Having an idol in your life is not a matter of having a statue to some god that somebody made up somewhere. An idol is anything you look to for hope and for your trust. It's the place that you look to for truth in life. It's the place you look to for ultimate value. It's the thing that you care about the most, the thing you obsess about the most. I recently came across a Bible study where a pastor was saying that he actually has a number of questions that he uses to diagnose what idols might be in your life. Here's a couple of the questions that he uses. Fill in the blank. If I only had blank, then I would be happy. Or here's another one. Fill in the blank. If I lost blank, then life would no longer be worth living. What is the first thing you think about when you wake up in the morning? What's the last thing you think about before you go to sleep? What things in my life can I give time, money, and energy to without hesitation? Right? There are some things, some opportunities that come up where you think, oh man, that'd be a big sacrifice. I don't know if I want to do that. Right? But then there's other things that when the opportunity comes, boom, you jump right on it. Maybe you even empty your bank account, right, just to go after it. Whatever your answer is to those questions, if it's not Jesus, then it is an idol for you, right? It is something that is absorbing your life. And once again, as David Foster Wallace pointed out, you have to be very careful what that thing is because it may very well eat you alive. A couple of illustrations to close this section out on the first commandment. First off, to get a few ideas of how God's people in the Old Testament looked at this command to have no other gods. You look at in Daniel chapter 3, the story of the three men in the fiery furnace. Three believers in the one true God, they were in trouble because King Nebuchadnezzar had commanded that everybody had to worship this one statue, and anybody who didn't would be thrown into a fiery furnace. And the three men, they respond to him, look, the God that we serve, he's able to save us even if you throw us into that fire. But even if he doesn't, just know we're not going to obey what you command. Right? And so for these guys, right, they feared God much more than they feared King Nebuchadnezzar's power. They trusted in God much more than they trusted that fire to burn their flesh. They loved God more than they loved their lives. Right? There's a pretty clear view of what it means to have no other gods. Another example comes from Ezra chapter 3. This is a section of history where the Jews had been in exile in Babylon for quite a long time, and they were coming back finally back to be in Jerusalem again. And when they get there, they're kind of having to build their whole lives up all over again. Some of them had to rebuild their houses. They didn't even have a wall up to surround their city, so they're not even living in safety and security yet, right? They're still in danger. Furthermore, many of these people are living in an agricultural kind of society, so they have to grow and raise the food that they're going to eat. And yet, in Ezra chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, you can read about how these people, even though they were afraid of the people around them, even though they only had so much to live on, they still prioritized worship services. They still came together to celebrate the festivals that God had laid out in His Word. They still offered just a ton of sacrifices to God. And remember, giving those sacrifices probably meant that many of those people went hungry. Once again, what did the first commandment mean to these people? It meant that they feared God more than they feared their enemies who wanted to do them harm. It meant that they loved God more than they loved a full stomach. It meant that they trusted God to protect them more than they trusted a full belly or more than they trusted having a wall around their city. For our final section today, we want to look at Jesus Christ and what He teaches about the first commandment. One of the first places we want to go to is Luke chapter 16, verses 13 through 15, where Jesus is having this interesting discussion, and He says, "No servant can serve two masters. Indeed, either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and mammon." The Pharisees, who loved money, also heard these things and sneered at Him. He said to them, "You are the ones who justify yourselves in the sight of people, but God knows your hearts. In fact, what is highly regarded among people is an abomination in God's sight." Here, that word mammon, it's a personification of worldly wealth. And so Jesus is recognizing that this natural desire that all of us have to get more money, to get more stuff, to have a more comfortable and enjoyable time here in life, that this can quickly become a god for us. And Jesus gives us this warning. You can't serve both that and Jesus. You can't love both that above all things and love God above all things. And so this is, again, one of the reasons why it's so vital, so important for us to keep a clear eye out and understand, what are we worshiping? What are my idols? One example of this that I'll share with you from my own personal life. I've been a churchgoer my whole life. I've been through tons of Bible studies. I've listened to plenty of Bible lessons and sermons, right? I've been to church. I probably missed maybe 2 or 3 Sundays of worship in my life, right? I've done it quite a lot. And yet, there have been times in my life where I was so in love with either a video game or some TV show that I really wanted to watch, that I defined my entire life, even those church services, as the stuff that I have to do until I can get to where I want to actually be. Playing those video games, watching those TV shows. And so again, there clearly I was worshiping that entertainment. Right? Even though I've been in church my whole life. And so again, it's really important for us to recognize, just because you're reading the Bible X amount of time, or just because you're going to church so often, doesn't mean that you have kicked away the idols. Right? Doesn't mean they don't have power over your life. And so part of Christian maturity is recognizing what idols are attacking you, and then putting into place some kind of plan. Maybe even talk with your family members, go through those diagnostic questions that I had before, and ask maybe some of your family members or a fellow Christian to help you identify what your idols are, and then put together some kind of battle plan for how you can fight them and how your fellow Christians can help you fight against those temptations so that those idols do not eat you alive. The last place I want to go here, as we've looked at this first commandment, we've seen very clearly how we've fallen short here, how we have not done what God wants us to do. We've seen that we can often tear our lives apart because we love the wrong things. And so it's valuable for us now to also recognize what Jesus has done for us. In Matthew chapter 4, Jesus fights this battle to have no other gods, and He wins absolutely, completely. This is what we want to recognize. Jesus is our righteousness. He earns the perfect moral spiritual track record for us. And so as you read these words, recognize that God, when He looks at your life, He doesn't see somebody whose life has been fraught with idols. Instead, He sees His perfect child who has done exactly as Jesus did here. Always put Him first in everything. This is Matthew chapter 4. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become bread." But Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him into the holy city. He placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, and he said to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Jesus said to him, "Again it is written, you shall not test the Lord your God." Again the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. He said to him, "I will give you all these things if you bow down and worship me." Then Jesus said to him, "Go away, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." Once again, bask in that victory that Jesus has won for you by being perfect in your place. This is that salvation that our God has won for us even before he brought these commandments into your life to improve your life by learning how you are designed to live, how you are designed to function, how we humans ought to live and love. Once again, I invite you to join us as we continue through this series. Next time, we'll talk about love for God's name, and we'll speak a little bit about what that means in the second commandment. And with that, God's richest blessings on you until we meet again.
And I say, can't be that easy. And he said, and no, it wasn't easy, but be still.